for that. And thanks once more. You may continue sitting there, or you can go back to your seats, whichever fits well. Right. And I'm glad to be working together. And at this point now, I'd like to invite Professor Nnamdi Elleh, who is head of School of Architecture and Planning at Wits University. He is going to talk to us briefly in about 15 or so minutes on comparative, theoretical, methodological, and conceptual approaches to the study of Africa-US cities. That really seems like a mouthful. I hope we'll not go to sleep, but definitely, sometimes we say those are just theories, but theories are important because they are the frameworks for our understanding issues. Welcome, Professor Nnamdi. And I want to say Professor Nnamdi lived for nearly 40 years in the US. I think he will tell us his story, even though we will manage his time a bit. Welcome.
Good afternoon, colleagues. And it's a pleasure to be here. The two colleagues who have just spoken to us sort of opened up the briefs that we will be discussing now. It would have been a session, but a few things come out for me. And that is a proposition by a Chicago urbanist, Robert Brugman, who wrote about photography and architecture in Chicago. He was at the University of Illinois, Chicago Circle. His last work, he said, cities are businesses. What do they have to offer citizens? In other words, do they want to offer clean water? Do they want to offer the best education? Do they want to offer safety? Do they want to offer recreative environments? And that cities do not think of themselves like that, but they are always competing. Just like anybody who is, assuming you open a restaurant, and what do you offer? Is it, what types of African dishes do you want to serve? What are the other restaurants in the district, in the city, and how far are people willing to travel? Now, we don't look at cities that way. We look at them as governance, metropolis, places that produce services. But in reality, day-to-day cities are always competing. The cities that have more jobs, people are going to go. They don't care how beautiful you are. They will go to that place where the job is better, where the atmosphere is better, where housing is cheaper. If you ask people who move, there is a reason they move. And I'll start with a tiny, tiny little example. Having lived in Cape Town on sabbatical and living here, I will not trade this weather for the one in Cape Town. They have Table Mountain, they have ocean. Forget it. Growing up in Chicago and Milwaukee by the Great Lakes, where the snow can be, and born in the tropics, in Nigeria, Equatoria, right above the equator, and live there, I got used to that weather. But I doubt I want to live, I want to do that again. My wife doesn't want it. That's the first thing that comes to her mind. And so we are bringing cities down to competition. They are always competing, but we don't think about them that way. That dovetails to a few items I want to highlight on the comparative theoretical methodologies and conceptual approaches to the study of US and African cities. In this regard, for example, Broadly speaking, I'll take the idea of China deciding post-Mao, and I remember the person, Dao Xiaoping, who said two policies, one China, two policies. That is Hong Kong, the capitalist place, and then mainland, the socialist place. And yet, some 20 years later or 30 years later, Hong Kong reverts back to China, and that tension remains still today. But what that brings to my mind is a city like Detroit, a city like Chicago, and Johannesburg. They have one thing in common: industry. And with the opening of China, the factory of the world, cheap labor, what happened? Factories moved. Automobile industries moved from Detroit. Heavy manufacturing moved from Pittsburgh, the steel capital of the United States. There is what we call the Rust Belt. And then Chicago itself. I'm a little biased. Please forgive me, I'm a Chicagoan. Now, a little settlement in 1780 by DuSable. What gave it its setting? The lake. What did the lake do? All transportation coming from the east, meaning New York, Washington, D.C., because of the Great Lakes, has to stop in Chicago. And all those coming from the west, from California, coming to go to the east, have to stop in Chicago. It became the railroad junction. By 1830, 1837, it was incorporated into a city, right on the port of by the Lake Michigan. And the joke is that everything going east, cows, lumber, corn, people, sheep, everybody changes train in Chicago. And that's why we have O'Hare International Airport, when flight became very common. And that's similar to here. We are inland, but we are a mining town from the 1850s. Chicago was about 1830, incorporated. By 1898, municipality of Johannesburg is incorporated, and settlements began to expand because of the mining. But something happens that is parallel. By the 80s, late 70s, Chicago was being decimated by the departure of industries. Detroit, the automobile capital of the world, was decimated. But it wasn't that the jobs disappeared. The jobs migrated to China and other places where labor was cheap. That's one paradigm or one conception. And the same thing happened here. But the most prominent one that I want to highlight is the shift of what could have been the city centers. In Chicago, the city moved towards O'Hare, northwest area. In the 70s, 80s, there was almost, the downtown itself was stagnant. Nobody was building. By 5 o'clock, 4 p.m., the city was empty. And Sears Tower was there, now known as Willis Tower, after they sold it about 10 years ago. But a mayor came in, Mayor Daley Jr. His father was there in the 60s. He was the mayor who elected Kennedy supported, let me put it that way, a Democrat. And he was famous for saying that the police is there, I'm paraphrasing, to preserve disorder. He made a mistake. That was during the Democrats' convention at the heat of the Vietnam War. But Mayor Daley Jr., when he came in the 80s, he had a plan. He realized that the Chicago waterfront was his gold. It's already called the Magnificent Mile, where if you watched opera, that is what you saw, Chicago's Magnificent Mile, Michigan Avenue, where all the big shops were. He brought industries together, mostly investors, and they rebuilt the city. A small airport, there was a business airport by the waterfront. The mayor was caught literally with his men scraping the airport off at night with bulldozers, because small jet airlines would fly in there. It is by the museum and the football team field. It was a museum campus. So that he had to remove that airport in order to expand O'Hare International Airport and create more. The expansion was creating more lanes, because the argument was that another airport should be built inland in the state of Illinois. He didn't want that. Nobody should compete with Chicago. He went that night, the executive field that was right there on Lake Michigan, where business people liked to fly in, he scraped it off, turned it into a park. And O'Hare got extra lanes. We've talked about how business is located here, Brampfontein, downtown. What we now have a multipolar city. And in that case, we can think of Sampton and Rosebank. When I was 20 years old, Milwaukee to Chicago is about 100 kilometers, approximation. It was cornfield. And as you drove through in two lanes, you smelled this corn and cows. And that's all you saw on both sides for that 100 kilometers. Now, it is a sprawled city. The two cities are combined, Milwaukee to Chicago. But just a thin layer of wood. But it is the interstate highway, which is now each side 3 to 4 lanes, and the railroad that connects the two, and people now commute between the two cities and from around the area. And Chicago has the enormous amount of railroad network. That dovetails to what is called the smart city. So you have Rosebank, you have Sampton, and you have all the suburbs that emerged in the 80s, but now Chicago is back on the driver's seat. To the extent that many of the big industries moved to Chicago. The last of them that I knew before coming here was Boeing. Left Oregon, left the state of Washington, Seattle, their headquarters, where they have always been, and moved to Chicago, right there on the Chicago River, about less than a kilometer from Lake Michigan. So the question is, what types of services do you put in place to attract industries? I'll touch on one more thing. Suburbs. And in this case, Johannesburg has many. Chicago, the types of suburbs are, you have Polish neighborhoods, Jewish neighborhoods, Armenian neighborhoods, African American neighborhoods, in different pockets. And but of course, there are mixed neighborhoods. It's almost like what you find here, where you only hear it on the news when there is xenophobic attack, to put it that way. Then you hear that there are certain places where immigrants settle. But that's been the nature, the ways that cities settle amongst each other. With that in mind, George Pullman in 1880 built a suburb outside of Chicago, about 40 kilometers from the downtown on the south side. But he was an industrialist. He manufactured railroad cars. He created a community that was to be hegemonic. He became a patron. You ate at a certain hour. You lived in a certain house. You obeyed certain rules. But eventually, when flights, the airlines industry boomed, competition expanded, Pullman dissolved, but it remains a tourist place for architects. I would like to open it up if there are some discussions to be had. Cities as competitive entities, businesses, according to Robert Brugman. And in that competitive process, businesses ask themselves, in the case of American businesses, the first thing they look at is this state. Does this state have higher or lower taxes? What are you going to write off for us if we come to your state and we create jobs? And you see the governors beating each other up, meaning, I'll give you this, I'll give you this. And the companies, in fact, they subsidize the companies. Then they go there and they say, we created this many jobs. Think about it. What the cities are offering, the governors or the mayors. Or is the union very strong? In the 80s, one of the things that emerged was that the automobile companies moved south. Those states do not allow unions. You cannot unionize. So Mercedes-Benz, Toyota, and they moved south, they migrated. Because union is being smashed from Detroit and Chicago. It's bad places. It's the bottom line that drove what became as booming. Charlotte, North Carolina, became a banking center all of a sudden because of its liberalization with taxation for industries and banks and credit cards. With that, I would like to stop if there are some discussions. I don't have all the answers, but I've indicated a few things. And I believe these items connect to the conceptions of what is called smart city. But cities are businesses. And that is what we must keep in mind. Tell the mayor, tell everybody. And thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Prof. I think that was a powerful presentation, both verbally and in terms of articulation. The decibels were high, but but also the content was, equally, invigorating. I think we will. I think Raina here has told me my time management will need some sprucing up. Just when I see her, I remember that we must run. So I think we'll entertain one or two questions to Prof, and then we'll dash for lunch and follow up with the program. Any questions or comments? There's one there. Let's take. There's one there. Any other? Okay, so I think we have two questions. We'll stop at those two questions. And any further engagements can be had with Professor Nnamdi over lunch. He's also chairing a session that's coming up shortly. All right?
Thanks, moderator. I do agree with the speaker currently right now. There is a need for us to start defining what do we consider as cities, especially in Africa. And I don't think we need a new concept of what is a city. I think South Africa on its own has already tried to define what is local government, if I may put it that way. We've got a number of policies and legislations that regulates what is local government. I think the challenge is it relates to, for South Africa, for example, if I can make a specific example, we've had a number of demarcations that have happened that has an impact in terms of how do we have a functional city. Sorry, moderator, this is just a comment, it's not a question. So the process of demarcation in this country has not assisted city development. And that is why we are somehow seen or regarded in some cases backwards. And some of the significant strides that we try to achieve in terms of economic development and so on, it gets hampered with the fact that how do we move development or such as automobile and so on to other areas where it can be regarded as a city as well or a secondary city. So for me, my point of view is that I think for Africa, we do need to define what do we constitute as a city and what do we constitute as a rural rural city, if we may put it that way. And that way it will be able a city is not defined by the fact that there's a number of people migrating into that space. A city is defined by how many economies or what levels of economy are actually working within that space. And I think that's a definition of need to work towards too. Thanks.
Right. I think we'll go to the second question, but before you do that, Prof, I think you make an interesting point, which was actually made yesterday by Lorna, that, in Africa, we have about, roughly according to UN Habitat, about 7,600 cities. The US has about upwards, I don't exactly, but about
19,600.
Yes. Now you see, there's a mismatch there, but the definition of a city in the US is much more liberal than on the continent generally. So that, if you went by population alone, Africa will have so many more cities and so forth. But I suppose that is also another area where our work is cut for us. Sometimes you're comparing cities in the US and cities here, and you're comparing different things. Prof.
I think you're right. You go by minimum population. In the US, it's like 25. I mean, in Africa, it's about 5,000. In the US, it can even be one person. There's actually a city in out west that has one person. But Prof, thanks for your presentation. I guess, to me, the other thing that perhaps needs to come up is the bad habits of US city development, which have been exported to Africa. For example, the dependency on cars.
Yes.
And I think if we follow that model, it's environmentally wasteful, and it's going to cause a lot of problems. And perhaps, and you can even talk about the internal models of land use in American cities, concentric circles versus the African model that has not been popularized. So maybe to me, then the other thing is perhaps asking you to see whether there's a way we can break out of these bad habits of importing American urbanization to our context, but without the wealth that sometimes goes with it.
Okay, over to you, Prof. If you can squeeze,
I'll be brief.
Yes.
I'll stand here. Thank you for the opportunity, and I agree with you. I actually desist from making the demarcation about defining urban and rural areas. Granted, there is population density, there is more countryside, but the important thing there for me is access. And nothing has caused that or proven the reality of access more than being a teacher in the classroom and students being in the rural areas who did not gain access. So access, which is in itself the idea that if somebody who is living in Sandton, Braamfontein, have equal access, or at least not access to the sources when they need to be in the classroom. We start to bridge that gap, and technology has actually eventually begun to bridge that gap. You can now transfer funds from any part of the world to somebody's cell phone in the village, right? And because in the past you would have to get in the car or get in the train or get on the buggy and travel to go to the bank. Now you can do it wirelessly. So there is a lot that is traveling, that is happening, that is dissolving that boundary between city and countryside. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The farms, the food, the quiet pace, it's all there. We recognize it. But I think we scholars, we make too much of that dichotomy. One place becomes the place of style, one place becomes the country, and then what we are heading to is class. So I try to remove that from the model. Then the exploitation of American urban models or European urban models. And I think that is a very challenging factor, wherein public transportation is not emphasized or it's badly underdeveloped. And people coming from afar bring what they now call the new civility. I'm not being sarcastic here, but that has been the history of Africa, United States, and Europe. Wherein, if you go to the Cape, you have what they call Cape Dutch. You go to West Africa, you have what they call Afro-Portuguese architecture. You go to North Africa, you have what they call Moorish or Spanish architecture. Or you go to Mozambique and Angola and Cape Verde, there you have Lusophone architecture. So there is moment for us to begin to critically investigate and critique these modernities, because they come down to one thing. Africa is that docile, inactive space where outsiders come to become active and bring civility. And that is what I contest. I'll stop there.